It's been mentioned several times today about the fact that we have a market which is constantly moving, constantly changing. Things are evolving, and one of the key things that's happened in recent times to the value and benefit of suppliers was the introduction of the Remedies Directive in December 2009. And if you haven't encountered it, you really should know a little bit about it. And if you are doing tendering into the public sector, it might open your eyes to a couple of things as well. We've actually had a Remedies Directive since 1989, and the original Remedies Directive that was brought into being was introduced originally to allow challenge against the award of a public contract which had been done wrongfully. It gave you as a supplier the right to challenge through the courts, and in those days to do it you had to go to the Court of Session in Scotland or the High Court in England, and it was a very expensive process, and basically no one did it. The Commission in 1999 introduced a ruling which was known as the Alcatel judgment at that time, and some of you will have heard of the Alcatel judgment. The idea of that was to put a standstill period in place before the award of a contract, again to give you the right to challenge what was being done. It was decided by the European Commission that so many of the member states were getting it badly wrong that they had to bring in a proper structured process. So through the new Remedies Directive that we had in 2009, they introduced two things. One was for harmonisation of the standstill period, and I'll talk about that first. And the second was the introduction of what they call ineffectiveness in contracts. And it means that if a contract's been awarded illegally, it can actually be set aside by the courts, and damages can be awarded to not only the complainant, but to all other parties to the contract as well. Basically, it's to make sure there's a level playing field. Actually, we've heard probably just about every one of the key phrases used by the European Union in terms of procurement today. The European Union has 5 key principles: non-discrimination, equality of treatment, transparency, mutual recognition and proportionality. And I think just about every speaker has used at least one of them. But they actually go together, and it means that there can't be any barriers or boundaries or borders to restrict you in terms of competition. And as I said earlier, you have to be treated the same whether you're tendering in Scotland, England, Bulgaria, Germany, Poland, or whatever it happens to be. The rules are the same for them all. So what they said is they wanted to have proper structured processes in place to make sure it was a level playing field, and if something was being done wrongly, you had the right to challenge. The first thing they looked at was the standstill period, and some of you who have tendered through the European regime will know the old Alcatel process, but it's changed. In December 2009, a new process was introduced. 2 different timetables. If it was done electronically, either through an email or fax, there's a 10-day standstill. Standstill starts from the day after the notification is sent, or if it's sent by post or courier or whatever, it's 15 days. Incidentally, if an authority sends you an email to tell you they're in the standstill period and follows that up with a letter, it's actually the written timetable that kicks in 15 days and not the 10 days. The information they send you has to give you a summary of reasons as to why they've made the decision. There are a couple of exceptions. If they haven't used the ODU route, so it's been a low value contract, Part B services, whatever it happens to be, there's no obligation to run a standstill. If there's only been one tender received, so if everybody else drops out and there's only one tenderer, not required, or if it's a call off from a framework contract, although there are issues around that in that any buying from a framework, there are grounds potentially for challenging the grounds of ineffectiveness, and we'll come on to that as well. In terms of the contract notice, you should be sent at the start of the standstill, and this is where I always get interested to see people's reaction, because people have been getting standstill letters and it never complies with it, or a lot of it doesn't comply with this. You should be told the criteria for the award of contract again, the reason they made the decision, including the advantages of the prospective winning bid, the name of that winning bidder, the score for yourself and for the prospective winning bidder, and a statement of either when the standstill will end or before which date they won't commence the contract. And that's a legal obligation in all ODU notices that you should receive that. If you haven't been getting it, the authorities who are notifying you or are not notifying you are actually breaking the rules. Because that's quite clear in the Scottish regulations and UK regulations. You must be given this information. If you're excluded at the pre-qualification stage and you haven't been given a debrief at that point, the obligation at the tender stage is merely to notify you why you were knocked out of PQQ. You're not entitled to any further information. But if you've gone through the tender exercise, at the very least, that is the information you should be receiving from an authority. If you're not, they're actually in breach of the rules and they're guilty of the grounds of ineffectiveness. Now, there are 4 things that deem ineffectiveness. 3 of them are to do with the standstill period, 1 is to do with what's known as a legal direct award. If an authority either doesn't run a standstill period or awards during the standstill period or goes ahead with the commencement of the contract even if there's been a legal challenge, it's actually only deemed as a technical breach. And in terms of a technical breach, there has to be another technical breach, an antecedent breach, before the court can set aside. If the only failing they have is in terms of the standstill, then they look at alternative remedies, and we'll look at that in a second. If it's what's deemed a legal direct award, and I'll explain those in a second to you, then it's cancellation of the contract, set aside by the court, unless the court uses its discrimination not to do so, which it can do in certain circumstances, in which case there will still be alternative remedies applicable to that contract. But you now have that legal right to challenge and stop a contract if you believe an authority has done something wrong. The important thing in terms of the antecedent breach and other technical breach, as I say, if you know something's wrong at the outset, you can't sit on that and wait to see if anything else happens, or if you don't win the contract before you can raise that challenge. The legal requirement now is if you know something is wrong, you raise a challenge as early as possible. And there have been legal cases to back that up. I said there's 3 processes for ineffectiveness. First is a legal direct award. On the basis of a legal direct award, you're looking at blatant or ignorant failure to procure by an authority. So even the claim of ignorance is no defence as far as the European Court of Justice is concerned. If an authority doesn't do the procurement route properly, they can be ordered to set aside the contract. If they make mistakes over the thresholds, someone was speaking to me at the lunchtime break about an authority who are doing £50,000 per annum contracts, where they're not going through the proper route apparently, or they're not doing things by quite the right route. It could actually be deemed as disaggregation, which is illegal, and the contract again could be set aside. If an authority claims a contract as a Part B service, when in reality it should have been advertised, again, illegal direct award. Incorrect application of TECO would be with an authority contracting with another authority when they have no legal right to do so. Glasgow City Council, for example, can give contracts to City Building because Glasgow City Council owns City Building. South Lanarkshire cannot. City Building has to tender for work with South Lanarkshire. If South Lanarkshire were to give a contract to City Building without competition, that would be a breach of the TECO agreement. So it happens, public sector bodies get it wrong. If that happens, it's contestable. If they use negotiated procedure incorrectly without prior publication, just to explain briefly, negotiated procedure is used in really extreme cases. For example, extreme urgency, where there is no time to go through even an accelerated process to tender. An authority can go direct to an organisation and basically contract with them to carry out a service or whatever it happens to be. But it has to be something that's out with the authority's control, no prior knowledge of the authority or the contracting body, and then they can do that. If they breach those rules, it can go to court. If there's a major variation in a contract, and this is one you need to watch out for with contracts you don't win. If you know you tendered for a service which was meant to be X, and that service becomes X plus Y, it's classed as a material contract variation. The simplest way to think of it is if a contract is for one thing, and by changing it, other parties could have tendered for it, that's deemed a material contract variation. So, I go out for a catering service to be delivered in a hospital. The hospital is paying part of the cost towards the food. It's a service contract. Halfway through the contract, the hospital decides that it's going to be a concession contract. The staff will pay for their own food. The hospital won't contribute any longer. That automatically becomes a material contract variation because it would have interested other parties to take part. That's the type of thing you're looking at. If you see that in contracts you've tendered for being unsuccessful and there's been a major change in that contract during its life, you have the right to challenge now. And finally, certain property transactions. There's been a failing for years in certain parts of the public sector where they believe that property transactions aren't covered with the European rules, when in reality they are. And again, if they do that incorrectly, it's a challengeable area. In all of these circumstances, the rule to the court is to set the contract aside, look at bringing in what's classed civil financial penalties, which is a nice way of saying fines, and looking at awarding damages to the contractors. And we'll look at that further.